Yes. Hello, welcome. This is Daniel Rich. Daniel was a student in my English 250 class, which is Introduction to English Studies. He created this presentation as part of an honors by contract, and after viewing it, I said, this is very good, you should do it at the student symposium, and I badgered him until he did. And so I'm so glad to be able to introduce Daniel.
I'm going to begin providing a little bit of context on what we're doing here today. Literary critics harbor a lot of influence upon how works are understood and perceived. This past semester I was introduced to a work that has fallen victim to such critics and whose meaning has been misconstrued. Stephen Crane's The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, published in 1897, is a well-known American short story, yet it is made out to be a humorous evaluation of Western living when there is in fact nothing humorous about it. Good afternoon, my name is Daniel Rich. This is Contextualizing of an Elegy Misinterpreted, and we're going to be taking a new historicist look at The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky. So what new historicism is, it's evaluating a text based on external context and information, not just looking at the pure narrative of a work. Right, but so let's look at the narrative because I'm sure many of you have never read this. So in this story, the Marshal of Yellow Sky, Texas, Jack Potter, is returning home from San Antonio aboard a Pullman train car. It's very fanciful, very grand, with his new bride. He's just been married. The newlyweds are a point of mockery for other passengers due to their lower class countenance. He has sun-weathered skin. He's not dressed quite as nicely. Meanwhile, in Yellow Sky, a drunken Scratchy Wilson, who is Potter's arch nemesis, grows frustrated when no one will duel him and terrorizes the town. Potter and his wife eventually return, and the Marshal, now a married man, cannot duel Scratchy Wilson. He's without a weapon. But instead of shooting Potter, Wilson merely walks away, leaving funnel-shaped tracks in the sand. Right, and so here are some of the common misconceptions by critics. John Berryman, a biographer of Crane, found the work to be a nearly singular vision of happiness. A.M. Tibbetts, whose opinions we'll look at later, posited that The Bride must be read differently for its nearly purely comedy, and Thomas A. Gullison cites that for years, The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky was read as a satiric comedy or as a hilarious parody. Right, so there's this idea that this work is about lighthearted, humorous sentiment. It's not posing any serious narrative. However, I completely disagree. I argue that The Bride asks readers to mourn the passing of the Old West and seeks to decry the effects of modernization that was occurring in late 19th century America. However, this can only be understood through a new historicist lens, and we're going to look at Roosevelt's and neo-romanticist creation of a counter-myth. Yes, I will explain what that means because that's a mouthful. And then Stephen Crane's other writings. Right? And so in late 19th century America, we need to look at how the West was changing. Right? So in the 1890 census, it's declared that a frontier line no longer has a place in census reports. And in an infamous essay by Frederick Jackson Turner, he talks about how the frontier is gone. Right? And so the frontier line is something that in the minds of Americans has separated Eastern industrialization from the West, right? This is a place of manifest destiny where you can go to escape and become someone new. However, these findings let us know that the frontier no longer exists, that industrialization and modernization has now come to the West, that there's now a barbed wire network of people fighting for cattle and land rights, and that it is a changing landscape. Right? And so the West is something that had been idealized in Americans' minds. It's a place of outlaws, of ultimate freedom. And so in seeking to still have the West exist and be idealized in the minds of Americans, a counter-myth needed to be created, right? Because the West had changed, but we still want to portray the West as sort of this otherworldly place. And so Teddy Roosevelt actually was a leading articulator in this counter-myth. He was a neo-romanticist writer. He was obviously president too, don't get me wrong on that. But so what neo-romanticists did was they played back to, in their writings and their art, nostalgia and fantasy, and they really idealized things. And so what Teddy Roosevelt did was he idealized the West. Except what he did was he now portrayed the West as a place for bourgeois co-option, right? This can be a place where industry, where modernization, where business can take hold. And then Owen Wister, another member of this group, wrote The Virginian, which is about a Western man who is tamed by his wife, and his wife teaches him to invest. Right, so clearly we're no longer looking at outlaws, but we're looking at more modernized people who just live in a different part of the country. Right, and so I actually think that what Stephen Crane does here is he satirizes this counter myth. He's poking fun at the fact that no, this is not the West we need to be imagining. This New West is fake. And so the Pullman train car that Potter and his wife return upon is called the New Estate. They're like, oh, this is who we are now. We're grand people. We're of higher ideals. But on board, Potter's portrayed as a different man, right? So he's the marshal of Yellow Sky, Texas. He's humble, he's bold, he's brave, he's courageous. Yet his glances become furtive and shy while he's on the Pullman train car. And he's shown an unconquerable kind of snobbery on the train car, right? So now he's a shell of himself. And the Pullman train car, I posit, is not as grand as it appears. And this is what Stephen Crane does really well, is he subtly inserts these sort of insults toward modernization and what is happening in the New West. So he mentions that frescoes are mentioned as only appearing at convenient places on the ceiling, right? So we have artificiality in the New West, right? There's the top layer, looks pristine, looks clean, looks to be of good intention, but below the surface, we have some things that are a little bit more sinister. We have snobbery, we have people who are going to judge you based on your appearances and based on your material wealth, right? And so another way we can understand this reading of The Bride is by looking at Crane's other writings and his trip westward. So he traveled west in 1895, and the critic Deemer asserts that Crane loved the West. He was infatuated with it, and he acknowledged that he was changed by it. However, when he arrived in San Antonio, he felt nothing short of outrage. And remember that San Antonio is this place where Potter and his wife are returning from, where they think they've now become new individuals. And so in his Patriot Shine of Texas article, Stephen Crane wrote about San Antonio. He says, one finds in the main part of the town little old buildings. The unprotected mass of them must get trampled into shapeless dust, which lies always behind the march of this terrible century. Right, so we have some pretty negative, connotative ideas going on here. Terrible century, shapeless dust. So clearly not a fan of San Antonio, and that's, that helps us understand how this new modernized West is not something he was a fan of in his writings. And so he also wrote two trips after his trip westward that can help us understand The Bride. So in The Five White Mice, the protagonist of the story courageously draws his revolver in the face of danger, right? So we have an Old West character separate from the New West, and yet he can act courageously. And this is something that Stephen Crane really admired. And then in A Man and Some Others, Stephen Crane shows sympathy for Western characters, right? So just as these works do, Crane's The Bride values the Old West, except what's different about this work is that we're looking at the loss of the Old West. It's now acknowledged as being gone. And so by looking at these external factors, let's look at Scratchy Wilson, because this is where a lot of critics get confused. So Scratchy's an outlaw, he's Potter's arch nemesis, he's a member of the old gang, and A.M. Tibbetts, who we mentioned earlier, thinks that Scratchy was never meant to pose a serious threat, and that this is why the work is of lighthearted sentiment. It's not serious. There's no real true conflict in this story. And he bases this on the idea that, well, when Scratchy and Potter encounter each other, Scratchy never shoots him, which is a fair point, except that, as Deemer asserts, violence has always been secondary to Crane's writings about Western living. It's not about the violence, it's about courage. It's about having the wherewithal to stand up to something you disagree with. And so that's not really a valid point to evaluate the meaning of a text upon. And then he also posits that Scratchy wears a maroon-colored flannel shirt and boots with imprints, right? He appears as a child's idea of a cowboy. But this does not mean to portray Scratchy Wilson as a character who's not posed a serious threat. It just seeks to show that he is outdated and he's weak in the face of a modernized change. He's powerless in the face of modernization and industrialization coming to change the West, because he is a representation of the Old West. He is outdated and he does not belong to this new modernized era. So in conclusion, through having a new historicist lens to look through, At the Bride, we have examined the socioeconomic landscape of the West in the late 19th century and evaluated the counter-myth, right? And through that, we've understood Crane's disillusionment with modernization and understood how the Bride Comes the Yellow Sky decries such modernization and asks us to mourn the changes that have occurred in the Old West. That's it. Questions?
Can you name a more contemporary work that you feel like one day we're going to read it and people will not understand? Because it seems like this kind of thing happens every century, right? It just takes a little while before you misread it.
This is really, this is kind of an odd one, but I think Dune, the sci-fi novel, because I really think it has a lot to do with ecology and changing landscapes, and I think a lot of people, obviously they just made a movie about it. They think it's purely this sci-fi action novel, but I think it really has a lot to do about ecological destruction, and I think that's something we're going to look to in the future, especially with how more environmentally focused we are now, and be like, yeah, there's probably more than meets the eye with that one.
The spice must flow is our fossil fuels.